Tonight on Nation to Nation, how close are we to ending discrimination in child welfare? Well, the story begins with a human rights complaint in 2007. The Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society argued that Canada was discriminating against First Nations kids in care. They said the federal government was underfunding the on-reserve system. With less prevention programs and less family support, First Nations kids were landing in care more often and staying in care longer than kids in the provincial system.
First Nations children are more likely to be in child welfare care today than at the height of residential schools by a factor of 3.
In 2016, the tribunal agreed the federal government was discriminating against First Nations kids and they were told to fix it. That was 2016. It's now 2025. In the 9 years in between, there were meetings, negotiations, more legal cases, draft agreements, and years of technical work. But there was no agreement until last year.
Canada and the provinces will need to do more to account for the harms that they have caused by perpetuating a racist child welfare system that has broken so many children in this country. The current system of apprehension and taking kids away is not working.
In 2024, a major settlement agreement finally appeared. Some chiefs saw it as long-awaited progress. Others said it didn't go far enough. Chiefs in Ontario voted to accept the agreement last February. Chiefs in the rest of the country rejected that agreement. They created the National Children's Chief Commission, the NCCC, and asked to renegotiate. The federal government proceeded on the deal with Ontario and said they had no mandate to negotiate a second deal. That left most First Nations without a seat at the table. Then last August, the Human Rights Commission ordered the government back to the table. And recently, Indigenous Services Minister Mandy Golmasti promised to meet with the National Chiefs Children's Commission.
I spent a lot of my time really focusing on trying to ensure that the decision that moves forward and thoroughly seeing the progress reports, the framework that the NCC is working on is reflective of what I'm hearing from the people that are receiving services from ISK. So trying to align those two spaces, it's important for us to do that work, and I'm looking forward to meeting the entirety of NCC.
So today we're going to look at these two paths. Where is that deal that Ontario signed last February? And what does the future look like for chiefs who walked away hoping for a better deal? So coming up after the break, we're going to hear from Regional Chief Abram Benedict about the Ontario deal.
So on behalf of the Chiefs in Assembly who have voted this morning, this afternoon, to authorize me to sign the final agreement on a long-term reform for the First Nations Child and Family Services Program on behalf of the Chiefs Ontario. Thank you for that authorization.
Welcome back. We're starting tonight with a look at where child welfare reform stands in Ontario. Now, last year, when a settlement deal was negotiated with the feds and that was made public, Ontario was the only region that decided to move ahead with it. They signed on last February. So what will the deal do and what's been happening since? Joining me now is Regional Chief Abram Benedict. Welcome.
Sego.
So Regional Chief, remind us why the other chiefs rejected it. I don't expect you to speak to that, but why did Ontario feel that this was a good deal?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's not forget that Ontario and the Snoqualmie Nation have been part of the negotiating long-term reform for the end of discrimination against First Nation children. And so being at the seat to negotiate an agreement, we've been able to help shape that agreement to meet the needs of our region. And so as we've seen, the National Assembly reject the agreement last year, in 2024, frankly, Ontario at that point said, look, amongst ourselves, we met, we felt that the agreement had the elements that were needed for us to advance the ending of discrimination against our children in our region. And our leadership voted overwhelmingly to proceed with an Ontario-specific agreement, and that's where we are now.
Okay, so I want to just say, like, what for people at home who have kids in care or are worried about having their kids put into care, what difference will this agreement, when it ultimately goes through, make for them?
No, absolutely. So this agreement has many parts to it. One is the child welfare protection of children, and also the prevention services and other services available for First Nation communities. Currently, the systems that operate are predominantly child protection. There are some prevention services that child welfare agencies do, but through this agreement, it puts the control back with the First Nation leadership to give them resources to provide prevention services to their members, and so that they can then deliver programming that they know is in line with community values and the way that community should be receiving programming. Now, I want to be clear, there always will be a role for child protection agencies in the envelope of serving children and families, but this agreement puts the First Nation leadership, who represent all aspects of community jurisdiction and programming community, with giving them resources to be able to do that for themselves.
Now, let me just ask you a few questions. So one of them I know you've talked about is prevention. I understand that was one of the major reasons why First Nations kids were going into care in higher rates in the first place. So now there's money for that. What about just keeping kids closer to home? That's been a concern of parents. Like, if their child has to go in, why do they have to go so far away? Is there something in the deal that will help with that?
Well, look, there's some resources in this long-term reform agreement for the Ontario region that will provide the community directly with resources to be able to support children and families in community. Understanding that the child welfare agencies are limited in their abilities to maneuver to provide some certain supports because they are constructs of the provincial government, and in our case, the Ontario government. And so there are regulatory, legislative restrictions that they have. And so they have come a significant way from the way child protection used to be, but there still is an element that belongs with community leadership. Community being able to offer programming, be able to provide additional supports ahead of incident or ahead of the need for protection, and that's extremely important. And so our leadership, understanding that that's important, but also part of this also acknowledges that we have a large amount of communities in the north, and the challenges that they face for access or to be able to have kinship care is completely different than what we see here in the north. And this agreement acknowledges the unique remoteness factor that exists in our region. And so, our leadership has taken a look at all elements of this and has said we need to advance this now. We need to end discrimination now in our region so that the leadership can be able to continue to support their children in care and their children in community.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So now this deal was accepted months ago. And so I think people thought, okay, it's signed, but where's it at? But it's not that easy. You don't just sign it and it happens. Where are things at?
Yeah, so what folks need to understand is that the negotiated settlement was done under the supervision of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And because this originated from a complaint that has resulted in a negotiated settlement, this agreement is required to be accepted by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as an agreement that ends discrimination against First Nation children in the Ontario region. And so therefore, we have had to put forward a motion for the tribunal to approve this agreement for implementation. And so where we are right now is we're at the approval phase in the tribunal process.
Okay, so what does that consist of? I mean, you were here in Ottawa this week, so you're here for part of that. What's going to happen?
Yeah, so this week there are hearings happening in front of the tribunal, and there are other parties involved in the whole national reform, and that includes the First Nations Caring Society, the Assembly of First Nations, these two parties are representing national reform, and the Snoqualmie Nation and Chiefs of Ontario are representing a regional reform process. And unfortunately, what we have seen is other parties objecting to the reform of the child welfare system in Ontario. And so the process this week will be parties who object making their submissions to the tribunal as to why they feel this agreement should not be advanced.
And why would a party object to it?
Well, the Assembly of First Nations has not taken a position at all on this. The Caring Society has put forward submissions, basically saying that they don't think that this agreement meets the long-term reform and will stop discrimination. And we feel contrary to that. Our leadership has taken a very good look at this agreement, understands what this agreement means, understands what it means for communities as a whole, and what it means for child welfare agencies supporting communities. And our leadership has said we must advance this now. We must end discrimination in our region. The resources must flow, and this agreement will do that. So it's very unfortunate that other parties don't feel the same.
Okay, and then let me just ask you one more question before we go, because I mean, this was in the works for a very long time, like for years. We're going on 10 years since the Human Rights Tribunal said that there's discrimination, the government has to deal with it. There was almost a change in government. And I'm just wondering, you know, I remember coming up to this election, everybody thought the Trudeau government was going to lose. We didn't know there was going to be a Mark Carney government coming in. And so was there pressure, like extra pressure, knowing that there was so much uncertainty with what was going to happen with the federal government for you to get a deal done, just in case the whole thing got wiped out?
Well, this was obviously one consideration. It was not all of it. We know that, you know, when governments change, if there's no, signature on the agreement, it potentially can be lost. But we knew that the elements in this agreement met the need of our region. It acknowledged a jurisdiction that has always been there for our nations as a whole. It provides additional resources. It flows money immediately so that communities can support their nations. You know, one of the oppositions has been that there's, you know, this is only a 10-year agreement, so it's a 9-year agreement. I think that, you know, in the world that we exist in today, there are no 50-year financial agreements. There are no 100-year financial agreements. Frankly, there's no 20-year financial agreements. The constructs that exist now, government has approval processes. A 10-year funding agreement is what we were able to negotiate. You know, we will work very hard to ensure our nations build capacity, meet the needs of their nations in the term of this agreement, so that at the end of the agreement, we can negotiate another term that will continue to provide those financial supports to our communities to make sure that discrimination doesn't continue.
Oh, thank you so much, Regional Chief, for talking to me today and getting us all up to date on that.
Absolutely. Now I'll go for the opportunity.
After the break, we're going to shift to the national picture. Child welfare advocate Cindy Blackstock will be here. Stay with us.
I'm Mary T.G. Gray. I am from Takla Nation. I am the proxy for my chief, Chief John French, and it's an honor to be on this territory. With that, good people, I think we need to stand and we need to honor Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Thank you, my sister, on behalf of all the children.
Welcome back. For almost 20 years, Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society have been at the center of this fight, from the original human rights complaint to the 2016 tribunal ruling that found Canada discriminates against First Nations children. Cindy Blackstock joins us now to talk about what's at stake nationally, what still hasn't been fixed, what needs to happen next to end the discrimination once and for all. Welcome to the show, Cindy.
Thank you for having me.
So Cindy, tell me, there was a deal that was signed last year. It was a child welfare reform deal that was valued at $47.8 billion, I believe, and Chiefs voted against it. Why did they think it was flawed?
It sounds like a huge amount of money, and it is. But like a lot of things, turned out to be too good to be true. When you read the fine print, there was a lot of discretion on whether Canada could pay that amount at all, or to what level. They had a lot of loopholes about not being able to pay that money. The other thing was the way the money was structured would not, in the Chiefs' view, really eliminate the discrimination. What do I mean by that? We want to make sure that dollars are getting to the children to address some of the major challenges they and their families are facing. And that wasn't really obvious in that agreement. Another piece that I often heard leadership talk about was the secretive governance. You would have all this money being decided by just a small group of people with no accountability to First Nations or the public, and that just doesn't work. And then the final thing was that it was a term agreement. You know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the survivors of residential schools, they asked more of us. They said, don't let this ever happen again. And so Canada has a legal order to not discriminate against any child, now or in the future, it's not just a 10-year thing and then keep your fingers crossed with Canada, because our experience with keeping our fingers crossed has not been good with kids.
Well, the majority of chiefs inside Ontario did overwhelmingly vote to take the deal. They didn't think the flaws were necessarily fatal. It's going through the process now where it goes back to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and ultimately may get signed off on. We're just talking to Regional Chief Abraham Benedict, and he said that you're actually doing an intervention against the deal. Can you just explain what's happening there?
Well, I think what's important to understand is that the tribunal, the question is whether Canada has met its obligation to stop discrimination now and beyond. And we have some questions for Canada. We see some of the language, we're not clear on what it means, whether or not it's a pathway for Canada to renege on the agreement, with Canada to actually infringe on national reform outside of Ontario. There's a number of paragraphs like that. We think it's worth having that conversation now before there's all the tribunal's orders go away, which is what is a condition of this agreement. There'd be no more application of the tribunal orders in Ontario. We think it's worth having the due diligence of making sure that we have clarity on what Canada's answers mean, and that we're not in a situation like we have with the treaties, where we have Canada completely, interpreting them on their own whim and often to the disadvantage of First Nations.
Okay, well, I want to move on to the idea of this national deal. What's happening outside of Ontario? And I believe, if I remember correctly, it was in February that the former Minister of Indigenous Services Canada said she had no mandate to deal with chiefs outside of Ontario. They had gone ahead and formed a National Chiefs Children's Commission and were hoping to get Canada at the table. So what's been happening with that?
Well, number one is we're not waiting for Canada. The National Children's Chiefs Commission is chaired by Chief Pauline Frost. The First Nations in the other regions have all appointed chiefs, often, the majority of them are chiefs, some of them are knowledge holders, to be on the National Children's Chiefs Commission, which I think has done heroic work. Karen, they have organized themselves, they have their own legal counsel, they have their own negotiating team, and they have their own secretariat, and they're getting no money to do this. I mean, what a message of love for our kids, right? And the National Children's Chiefs Commission has reached out numerous times to government saying, look, come back to the table in good faith, but those legal orders have to be the floor. And there hasn't been a lot of take up. We've starting to see some conversations with the minister that may be an opening, but up until now, it's been a door shut.
What's been happening? Oh, I was going to ask, what was happening with the Canadian Human Rights Council? Didn't they compel the government to go to the table?
Yes, they did. They actually said that they said this. In August they issued a ruling, and they said, "Look, Canada, you cannot just sit there and try to stall everything. By December 22nd, you have to come up with a plan with evidence about how you're going to stop your discrimination permanently." We would encourage you to work with the Caring Society, the Assembly of First Nations, and the National Children's Chiefs Commission, who are going to be out speaking to rights holders and to their experts to come up with their plan. Well, Canada refused to do that. And so, but we have undertaken that work, and such great credit to the communities in the regions. They organized all of their engagement sessions. They sent us their best ideas. Now we're rolling those up, and we will be filing our plan, and Canada will be filing their plan on the 22nd of December, and the tribunal will make a decision after that. It's really important for people to understand that this isn't a situation where you just have to rely on an agreement with Canada. You don't have to rely on what Canada's just prepared to agree to. There are legal orders against Canada that say that you have to hit these minimum standards, and there's legal oversight over them. So this is in a legal case. So we always welcome discussion, but not below the legal orders and minimum standards.
Well, I have one last question for you. I'm going to switch topics just slightly to Jordan's principle. I think we've been covering quite a lot what's been happening since Indigenous Services Canada issued a bulletin that began to pull back and restrict the program. The Indigenous Services was approving too many things. Some things may be outside the scope of the program, so they decided to do that and narrow it that way. I know you have arguments against how they approach that, but where are things at? Because it does seem like a lot of people are getting cut off.
Yeah, they are. The wrong people are getting cut off. And in my view, what they did is they took what was a management problem from the department, i.e. their own officials approving things that maybe shouldn't be approved, and then they made it the kids' problem by saying, well, the remedy to that is actually cutting all these kids off of absolutely life-saving and life-necessary services. It made no sense. And the other thing is that there's no evidence that the federal government has that this misuse is widespread. The other piece is that they dropped down this policy of this bulletin that, as you say, really limited access to Jordan's principal. And we know through access to information documents that APTN also has a copy of, that when they did that, they said, oh, we're going to cut all these services except if substantive equality applies. And what that means is we know First Nations kids have had more than their share of multi-generational trauma. So they're going to need more services, sometimes more than what's available to non-Indigenous children who haven't had those experiences. That's what substantive equality is about. And they put it in fine print and then cut all those services. But when we saw in access to information documents, Karen, they didn't have a definition of substantive equality. They had no criteria. So it was nothing other than giving the government legal cover while they breached the orders. And we have over 140,000 requests in the backlog with the Government of Canada. Now, we use the word backlog. That means that they haven't opened them or they haven't decided on them. But I'd like to use a different word, and that is 140,000 violations of legal orders regarding children's rights, because that's also true. Canada is legally bound to determine these within certain time frames. And what we have found out is that for individual cases, Canada could fix that backlog with $43 million. That would be $380 a child. And Karen, that is a quick way of clearing off that backlog for individual cases and then cleaning up their management so they can do it in a good way. But that way children aren't paying the price. And let me tell you, if they don't do that, it's going to cost the government a lot more, because we're already hearing of children sadly losing their lives, losing their childhoods because they're denied these services. And there will be a class action that was going to cost the government a lot more than fixing the problem right now.
Well, you always put things in such simple terms, and it just feels like it's such a simple fix. But it sounds like you've got a battle going ahead.
I think sometimes we do, but I just think that's been the greatest puzzle of this whole case all along. Is doing the right thing for kids is the right thing to do for the child, and it's the right thing to do for the economy. It's the right thing to do with the First Nation. It's the right thing to do with the country. And I don't know why it's so hard to get the government to come across the line. Hopefully they start to see the wisdom of that and do the right thing, because they have all the tools at their disposal. All the solutions are sitting right there. They just need to pick them up and put them in play.
Thank you for talking to me today, Cindy.
Hey, thanks for having me, Karen.
And that's our Nation to Nation for tonight. Join us next week. We're actually going to have some fun. It's almost Christmas. We're going to do a year-end quiz that you can play along with, and our reporters panel will be back. We'll take you behind the stories and tell you the surprises, the tensions, and the things that never made the headlines. If you've missed any part of this show, you can always catch the podcast at aptnnews.com/podcasts. Good night.